Okay, so let's jump right in. We're looking today at something quite striking.
Mm.
This historical parallel,
Hmm.
between liberation movements that became ruling parties.
You mean the ANC in South Africa and ZANU-PF up in Zimbabwe?
Exactly. Think back. Mandela, Mugabe. Huge figures, immense hopes surrounding them initially.
Oh, definitely. That initial period, there was just this wave of optimism, both domestically and internationally, too.
Mandela became this global icon, obviously. And Mugabe, well, he also had quite a bit of goodwill internationally in those early days.
He did, which makes looking at Zimbabwe now, well, it's tough. The economic situation, the political climate, the sheer number of people who felt they had to leave.
And that's the core of what we're exploring, isn't it? Could South Africa face similar challenges? Is Zimbabwe perhaps a warning?
It's a valid question. It forces us to look hard at how these movements handle the shift from fighting for freedom to actually, governing.
The ideals versus the reality of holding power long term.
Precisely. And Zimbabwe is a very potent example as we consider what South Africa is dealing with right now.
So let's go back again, 80s, 90s. ZANU-PF, the ANC.
Yeah.
They were seen as these forces for good, almost heroic.
Absolutely revered in many quarters.
But then you see divergences. Mandela stepping down after one term. That feels significant compared to ZANU-PF's long rule.
A very different approach to power and succession, yes.
And now, fast forward, and the ANC is facing accusations. Corruption, patronage. That sounds disturbingly familiar to what was being said about ZANU-PF maybe, 15, 20 years ago?
Indeed. That slide from liberation hero to accusations of graft and, well, maybe even authoritarian tendencies, it's a pattern we've seen elsewhere, too.
So what happened in Zimbabwe? Was it a slow erosion?
It seems that way. Trust diminished over time, and crucially, perhaps, those democratic checks and balances. Maybe they weren't strong enough or they got weakened along the way.
Which leads us straight into this whole mess of corruption and state capture allegations here.
Mm.
The sources we looked at, they really detail things like the Gupta scandals, Eskom's collapse, the failures in basic services, yet it feels systemic.
It does paint a picture of deep-seated problems, and that reminds me of that quote, Edmund Burke.
Oh, the one about good men doing nothing.
The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. It makes you wonder, has the response within the ANC to these kinds of issues been enough or fast enough?
It's a tough question, because once corruption gets its hooks in deep,
It really eats away at the state itself, doesn't it? Diverts money, kills public trust, stalls progress. The parallels with Zimbabwe in the 2000s when those corruption stories really started swirling, they're difficult to just, brush aside.
and the human impact, that's undeniable. We're talking potentially over 1 million Zimbabweans coming to South Africa.
Fleeing difficult conditions, seeking better opportunities.
And the strain that puts on South Africa. I mean, hospitals, schools, housing, the job market,
Yeah.
these systems are already under pressure.
It really highlights how linked the region is. You can't just view these as isolated national problems. What happens in Zimbabwe directly impacts South Africa.
Absolutely. Which makes the next point feel quite complicated.
The ANC government's position towards the Zimbabwean government.
Yes. Despite this huge influx of people, there seems to be a reluctance, often, to criticize Herrera openly. It feels almost contradictory.
It does seem that way on the surface.
It brings to mind Frantz Fanon. Each generation must discover its mission. Has the ANC maybe lost sight of part of its original mission? Standing against oppression?
Well, it's complex. There's the history, isn't there? The liberation movement solidarity.
Yeah.
It runs deep. Criticizing former allies publicly is tricky territory in diplomacy.
Sure, I get the history. But the sources also hinted other factors maybe. Economic interests, geopolitics.
Those could certainly play a role, too. International relations are rarely about just one thing. They're usually layers of strategic thinking, economic ties, regional dynamics.
But does that justify the silence if people are suffering? Doesn't silence risk looking like, well, complicity?
That's the tightrope walk, isn't it?
South Africa could be such a powerful voice for good governance in the region. If it doesn't speak out, does it weaken its own standing, its moral authority?
It's a serious consideration. Regional leadership often demands taking principled stands, even when it's uncomfortable. A perception of silence on human rights or democratic backsliding can definitely impact influence.
So, thinking about the potential consequences, if South Africa doesn't change course or address these internal issues, what are the risks?
The sources suggest some worrying possibilities. Economic decline, perhaps echoing Zimbabwe's troubles to some degree.
A loss of faith in democracy itself. maybe leading to more extreme politics.
That's a real danger.
Yeah.
When people feel the system isn't working for them, they can be drawn to populist extremes. And then there's a social fabric.
You mean things like xenophobia?
Sadly, yes. Economic hardship and resource scarcity can fuel tensions between communities. We've seen tragic examples of that already.
And South Africa's influence in the region could shrink too.
Potentially, yes. If internal problems mount and its regional stance seems inconsistent, its leadership role could be diminished. It's like a whole cascade of potential negatives.
Which brings us to that scenario. The hypothetical South Africa 2030. It's presented just as a warning, not a forecast, but still.
It's pretty bleak.
70% youth unemployment, a drift towards one-party dominance, journalists in exile, the power grid totally gone, a militarized police. It sounds alarmingly like Zimbabwe's recent past.
And that's the point of such scenarios. Not to say this will happen, but to show what could happen if current negative trends aren't arrested. It underlines the urgency.
It's not all doom and gloom. The sources do suggest ways forward, right? Paths to avoid that kind of future.
Absolutely. There are actions that could be taken, like holding the Zimbabwean government more accountable.
And maybe stop legitimizing elections that might be flawed.
That's part of it. Advocating for real reforms within regional bodies, SADC, the AU, using South Africa's influence there.
And maybe the most important part, looking inward.
Definitely. Serious reform of South Africa's own institutions. Strengthening governance, tackling corruption head-on, that's paramount. For domestic stability and for regional credibility.
So it feels like we've come full circle. South Africa's at a crossroads, a really critical one.
It does feel that way. The ANC, with its incredible history, faces a huge choice.
Can it break this cycle we've been talking about? Or does it risk, following that path we've seen elsewhere?
The decisions made now, the actions taken or not taken, they will shape the future. Will there be a genuine recommitment to good governance, accountability, the rule of law?
And will it use its weight in the region for positive change? Those seem like the key questions.
They really are.
It definitely gives you, the listener, a lot to think about. What's happening or happened in Zimbabwe? It's not just some isolated event over there.
No, the connections and potential implications are much closer to home than we might think.
It makes you ponder, doesn't it? What role can ordinary people play in pushing for accountability and the kind of future they want to see, not just here, but across the whole region?
A question worth reflecting on long after we finish talking.